You have good sound. Actually, check this. All right. So it's working. We are now live.
We are now live.
Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Exalted Scarfcast number 11, I believe.
Or so. And we're gonna do something on Halloween. We're gonna drop we're gonna focus specifically on the influence of H.P. Lovecraft tonight.
Yeah, as
And
we're
various other
getting
things.
yeah, since we're getting closer and closer to Hallows Eve. So here's our spookier podcast. So, I think we'll start with comics first.
So I'm actually gonna focus on a couple different things. There's been okay, so generally H.P. Lovecraft is one of the most comics traditionally come from the pulp influence. They're very huge in that world, and they're very important overall. So there's always been like some backdraft of H.P. Lovecraft in there, even in the earlier comics. Mostly, a lot of them were very short horror stories and various other things. But specifically, H.P. Lovecraft comics, the most well-known ones at the moment are what I like to call the Alan Moore, the Alan Moore Lovecraft trilogy, and it's made up of three particular works. The Courtyard, which is the first one. Providence, which is the third one. Now, they act as deconstructions, well, not really deconstructions in the traditional sense. I would say they're more like tribute pieces. Because it's clear Alan Moore does love the work very much. It's just that he's adding in some extra commentary about them to kind of put them in place in history. They don't always work, though, and I'll get to that particular bit. And I'm just also now taking care of one thing here because
Yeah, you're coming in pretty loud, I think.
I'm coming in pretty loud. Then I will be careful.
Yeah,
Anyway,
is it a new mic or something?
it's usually my old bad.
Your old bad what? We still connected? Hello? Uh-oh. Has the Cosmic Horrors gotten David as well?
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, good, he's back.
All right,
We almost had a horror movie moment with you.
fair. Anyway, so like I said, the three Alan Moore books. So the Courtyard is the first one, and it involves basically it was originally a short story, and it was adapted to comics later. To sum it up, it's basically involves an XP of H.P. Lovecraft himself, the writer.
Yeah?
So it involves him, and we basically he basically has a Cthulhu adventure. Now involves basically his at the time racism and his sexual proclivities. Mostly the character is portrayed as an asexual. And this would be a theme with Neonomicon, because and Providence, of course, because there are H.P. Lovecraft works that don't really focus on the racism. They focus specifically on the sexuality, which so a lot of people often deconstruct Lovecraft from one place, which is the racism aspect. And Alan Moore does some of that stuff, but a lot of it is focused specifically on talking about sexuality in the early centuries and various stories. Mostly because of, well, so H.P. Lovecraft would always not describe events in his books. So anytime we see like horrifying monsters and stuff like that,
Oh dear, you cut out again. All right, well, I'll fill in this part in terms of how the how Lovecraft. You good?
All right, give.
Yeah. Well, anyways, yeah, I'll let you know when David's back. But yeah, the way Lovecraft does describes his monsters is that he tends to be very either very vague or so painstakingly specific that you that you're not even sure what you're looking at. I mean, one example of I mean, you can see plenty of examples of how vague he does his monsters. But one of the only times where you see something very painstakingly specific was the book At the Mountains of Madness when he describes the frozen old one. And he describes it the way that the scientists at the time were trying to describe it where they were. You all right, David?
Yep.
All right. Where they would describe, okay, what kind of material it has, its particular like shapes, proportions. They even go back and forth in terms of determining whether or not this is a vegetable or an animal. Uh, and they even go on to seeing that there are certain like properties and
Hello?
veins. Yes, I can hear you now. And it
Yay.
and it goes into so much detail that even then it kind of feels like you're getting like short glimpses but from multiple angles. It's like a very painstakingly close zoom in shot. And then most other instances is where he would use for when he describes the monster encounters, he would use like various adverbs or various rejoinders in terms of like unholy or it's like abominable, eh, and explain that. I mean, one example was one creature in the short story The Festival, where he described them as not entirely decomposed corpses, not entirely ants, not entirely birds, but some kind of combination of the three. So it really forces you to use your imagination to figure out, okay, how do all those factors fit in? He leaves a lot to the imagination, and that's also what helps. I mean, the Dunwich Horror was sort of described as something that moves almost spider-like, but it almost looks kind of like an octopus, but it has the face of Wilbur Wheatley on it.
Hmm.
Stuff like that.
Well, yeah, so we found more stuff specifically, and one of the reasons why I bring up the unique whole sexuality thing about the story, and this is just, he describes a lot of the various rituals, and you actually see them on panel being performed. So and a lot of it involves sex, specifically. This is where it gets a little controversial here because I'm just going to have to talk about fish rape. Okay, let's just get into this.
Thanks, Shadow
So,
over Innsmouth.
let me actually explain this whole thing. It's not even Shadow over Innsmouth. So, Neonomicon is actually pretty important. Like, Providence was kind of advertised as like you can read it without reading the other ones. And unfortunately, you can't unless you have to actually read Neonomicon to get the full story on that one, because the ending scene does not make sense at all unless you read it. But Neonomicon is one of the worst kind of works from Alan Moore. Honestly, it's not that great, but it's interesting. Um, it's because it starts out pretty normal, but then the main character gets trapped by a deep one and is forced to have sexual congress with it. So she ends up getting pregnant with its child. And I'll talk about this in a second and what that child becomes, because it's a unique play on one character in the Cthulhu mythos, or I should say Lovecraft mythos. And that's a pretty big one right there. But anyway, so this leads into Providence, which is a 12-issue miniseries. This 12-issue miniseries is focused specifically on a reporter who's secretly closeted in the 1930s and 40s, exploring different H.P. Lovecraft stories. Shadow over Innsmouth, the God dang it, I sometimes my memory over names escapes me, but all the major Lovecraft stories get like explored. So I'm just gonna make sure I just have the name. I think the only one he doesn't do is Mountains of Madness, which is the classic one. But there's there's the case of Charles Dexter Ward. There's references to Color Out of Space. Cool Air is the first one. The Dunwich Horror, of course, is the major one. The Shadow over Innsmouth is another major issue as well. There's the Red Hook Horror was a pretty major.
The horror at Red Hook, yeah.
The horror at Red Hook. Thank you. Look, hey. You're the H.P. Lovecraft dude here.
Yeah.
I'm going to constantly defer to you on this one. I've read a bunch of stories at this point, though I'm a bigger Robert E. Howard dude. I find his stories equally fascinating in the way you probably do. So, speaking of which, I'll actually talk about him a bit later, since they were actually real good friends in life, of course. Anyway, besides the connection with Robert E. Howard and stuff, and what the story does is try to tackle the idea of H.P. Lovecraft talking about American societies during that. You see, a lot of the fears H.P. Lovecraft had were based on real people he was scared of. So, like the Dunwich Horror, totally about Hicks, and how he was just like, oh, those back-barrened people, how could they? And various other things like that. It's not just the racism aspect either. It's just basically primal fears are a common factor. So there's a lot of play into that. One issue actually talks about in the Dunwich Horror possibly connections to early fascism stuff as well, which is actually very interesting. It's not done in a bad way like some other stories would do it. Let me put it this way. What I like about Providence is it doesn't just present one horrible thing about H.P. Lovecraft to deconstruct. It feels like it knows what it's talking about and is actually playing with a lot of different things. Now, the big problem with the story is that it's kind of self-indulgent in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, that just is kind of how it is. And there's a lot of stuff. Alan Moore did a lot of research, including making the most expensive comic panel of all time. Somehow, that man was just like, I'm going to use my crazy wizard influence and get a lot of money to make this one comic panel, and it's going to cost $3,000 for one panel. Which is insane. You might be wondering, how does that work? Well, are you?
Yeah, I would be. I mean, I looked the panel up myself, but I'm having technical shenanigans on my PC.
I will explain it very simple. It's actually a photo. He inserts a photo into the panel, and he used real makeup and effects and a photo shoot, and it totaled out to $3,000 for a single panel. I think it's about $3,400, but I have to look it up exactly. But according to Alan Moore, and honestly, it probably is the most expensive comic panel of all time. So, yay for medium blending and expense. No wonder Avatar is now kaput. That was the comic company who published it. So, with that said, this whole comic was basically kind of like the Watchmen of H.P. Lovecraft. It brought an interesting idea about Cthulhu in it near the end, and this is going to get into spoilers, so you are warned now. So the big thing about it is that he actually does tie it back to Cthulhu and that woman. You see, that woman's actually giving birth to Cthulhu. You see, he brought up an interesting point about Cthulhu, is that if all the H.P. Lovecraft monsters, he is the most human.
Uh-huh.
Well, like, out of all the gods, he actually is described as looking humanoid. So he actually brought up that weird aspect about it. It's like, you clever bastard, I'll give you that one. So we're dealing with the idea. It ends before, like, we see Cthulhu awaken and we become part of his dream, but it's an interesting idea at the very least. And like I said, there are deconstruction elements like that and plays with stuff. My personal little favorite reference is Herbert West and his assistant are actually gay in this, and plays with that a bit. Again,
Well, that was a story that Lovecraft didn't really take seriously, so...
to be fair, there's a lot more gay characters than I'm mentioning in this one. Again, it is a huge focus of the comic. So I would say that don't let that speak to you. One of the whole ideas of the comic is that these are basically the stories H.P. Lovecraft based his stories around, and the characters just going through the real world locations of it. So it's actually kind of an interesting historical document, though again, it's self-indulgent. I can't really... It's not gonna be... I don't even think it's Alan Moore's best work. It's just kind of an interesting read overall. And like I said, just in case like we have people watching, please feel free to ask us questions in the chat. I'm willing to answer them as they come in. So, hey.
Yeah, I'll answer the Lovecraft ones to the best of my ability.
Yeah, anything questions. So, there are, of course, many Cthulhu horror stories. Boom Comics produced a bunch of them. And there's actually an ongoing Cthulhu one. I have not read it yet, but I'll try. Look, honestly, it's like, sometimes why bother? And of course, there are comic adaptations. There is one of the Mountains of Madness that is actually pretty good. Honestly, the way it imagines the penguin monsters is kind of scary, but it has a cute indie art style that might not be everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah, well, in the book, I mean, the albino penguins were described as monstrously huge.
Yeah, it does a good job with them, though. So, hey, it's just an odd... It's just one of those things that just, like, it's very odd. I would actually recommend seeking it out if you can. It's a good read. There's also been some Conan crossovers on occasion with the mythos as well, which is fascinating. You see, H.P. Lovecraft and Robert E. Howard were friends, so they actually shared some story stuff together.
Yeah,
So
you wouldn't think Conan would mix in well with the Cthulhu universe, but they did.
Conan is the man. He's like, cosmic horror. I am Conan. I have pecs.
Yeah, he does fight a few cosmic horror creatures, but that was back in the age of Hyperborea. In fact, it's canon that Hyperborea and the Cthulhu Mythos universe are in the same universe.
Yeah, there was a lot of crossover with that early on, so hey, good for Conan. He was just like, yo, I'm gonna get in on this MCU shit before everyone else. But jokes aside with Conan, I love Conan stories. They're fun, great, excellent little stories. With Conan, and sorry about the ums if you guys hear them. I'm trying my best here to minimize them. Conan stories are fantastic, and I can't wait to dig into some more later on. But with that said, there's a lot of great little horror comics that aren't necessarily cosmic or Cthulhu related that are very good too. Honestly, you can find so much cosmic inspired that isn't Cthulhu mythos that is good stuff. Honestly, There's this one comic that I don't think is great. It's called Ocean, and it's about like this group of archaeologists in space find this ancient alien civilization, and it plays with some Cthulhu mythos traps, mostly because the aliens are at one point able to mind control the humans into killing themselves off and stuff like that. It was written by Warren Ellis, and there's some interesting stuff. Freaking A. And now I just reminded myself of. Okay, so there's this comic called Planetary the Authority, and this is actually a Cthulhu issue, believe it or not. You see, the Planetary is a comic about dissecting pop culture, especially adventure pop culture in the 20th century. And of course, H.P. Lovecraft would be part of that. You can't really do anything about dissecting pop culture without talking a little bit about him. It has an interesting portrayal of H.P. Lovecraft that really does play up the racism angle. For one thing, it actually has this word that I can't really want to say on air right now, but he calls something eggs, involves a special word, and I'm going to leave it at that.
Great.
It was years ago, man. Honestly, it was way before like any of this current discourse about him. I always feel like he's a bit. Honestly, I have issues with the current discourse about him because. So I have this one friend we're gonna call Tommy Boy here. Tommy Boy actually made a great post recently. I saw it on Facebook about him, where he pointed out that H.P. Lovecraft basically changed his ways during his life, and at this point, it's like, why bother? You know, it's while there is issues with H.P. Lovecraft's racism, it's not like he made any money off the Cthulhu stuff or anything else. He wasn't a great writer, and a lot of his influence, like the guy changed his tune near the end of his life at that point. So it's like, what can you do? I mean, you know, we can easily be mad that, you know, he had those views, but he did change as a person. So, hey, Cthulhu, like, you know, we don't really have to talk about his problems, honestly.
Yeah,
So,
and you don't have to feel guilty for liking his works.
At least not as much. Honestly, I do think there's some reason to look into it. It's one of the reasons why I don't like Lovecraft Country as a show. I tried. I really did try to give it a chance. But it's a show that doesn't get H.P. Lovecraft and is only using his name.
Yeah, I figured that out on the first episode. It's like, oh.
Dude, it's kind of insultingly bad. Like, if people go in and know anything about him, it's one of the most insulting things you can do because it's basically using his name to prop up a story that could easily be told without it.
It almost reminds me of the way J.J. Abrams did did horror films, where he would just have it become more or less a drama story around like characters having relationship issues, but the horror scenes are just off in the background somewhere. I mean, that was something that that I had issues with Cloverfield and even Super 8, for example.
Well, it's mostly because he often works in a PG-13 environment, which I'm not really a huge fan of usually with horror sometimes. It can work not showing the horror can work as a thing, but I do feel like at times it feels like there's a deliberate attempt to hold back way too much with ratings.
With horror nowadays, they try to make it more about atmosphere. So the and part of it is because of the whole PG-13 rating. So they have to do as much as they can without being gratuitous about it.
True.
I mean,
I don't mind.
I mean, good directors know how to do that, but we're not getting good directors.
Well, anyway, Lovecraft Country is just a kind of disgrace of a show. I'm looking up at it, like, God, the TV tropes page for everything on it stops at episode 4, it seems. It doesn't seem like it has a real fandom outside of some hardcore people
Or
about it.
Jordan Peele fans. I mean, that's
Uh,
about the only people who will be watching it.
Well, honestly, I look at it. A lot of people are like, it's this great examination of pop culture, but it has been done better before. It doesn't really comment on H.P. Lovecraft. And unfortunately, it doesn't comment on the nature of horror and powerlessness. Because one of the problems with HP, with doing anything horror related, is that it's a show clearly wanting to do a story about empowerment. And God dang it. Did you hear about like one aspect about the story where at the end of the show, one of the main characters basically causes white people to stop being able to use magic. And I'm like, wait, what? 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 And honestly, even by show standards, it does a pretty bad portrayal of other minorities. They kill off a trans Native American woman.
I guess that's their commentary on Elizabeth Warren then.
That might be. Um they do a lot of bad stuff in that show. They also made a really horrible Jewish stereotype that actually kind of offended me.
Yeah, you could imagine how I feel about the show.
Yeah, no, like considering like your ancestry, I mean like
Yeah, it's like, oh jeez. I don't even want to know what they've done with the Shoggoths in that show. And they have established, yes, those things are supposed to be Shoggoths.
Oh, and hi, Silver Eye. I'm sure you're from my Twitter. I just don't know who you are. What would make this thing sell better? Using a well-known name and nothing at all from the source material.
Yeah, that sounds about right for modern Hollywood.
Yeah, like I said, it sounds so right for it, but my God, I just can't stand anything that does something like that. Mostly because it just sets me up for disappointment. Like I really like to see them actually try if they're adapting source material. Sometimes it's nice if they use a name, but I rather see actual source material get used, you know? But then again, that is my hope for humanity.
Or at least
Not yeah.
or at least just an understanding of the source material. You could write new stories within that universe to try to keep it within like consistency of the source material. I mean, my ideal Call of Cthulhu or H.P. Lovecraft show wouldn't be just based off of H.P. Lovecraft, but based off of Weird Tales, where it was a compilation of short stories done by not only Lovecraft but various other people, even your boy who did the Conan series.
Robert E. Howard.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Rob. Like you could just have it be an anthology series where it's kind of like the Twilight Zone, but with mythos creatures.
Well, I had an idea for a show called Real Lovecraft, where basically the idea is, I call it Real Lovecraft because I kind of want to show like it's about two guys from the future who are trying to recreate Lovecraft stories from the ground up and tell those stories for an audience. And we see them try to wrangle H.P. Lovecraft. First thing we see is the actual story, and then we see them talk about it. And it's a very interesting idea, very meta in its own way. But H.P. Lovecraft, as a guy, never had a major adaptation, honestly. Like, there's never been an actual major H.P. Lovecraft work. So having a work try to say it's commenting on it is kind of insane because it never became a big thing in pop culture. At least in comparison to, say, like Conan has a much bigger footprint than H.P. Lovecraft does.
Well,
not just for inspiration, but movies, characters, and archetypes.
well, here's what I've noticed is that it's mostly an accessory to pop culture. I mean, it's not something that's major pop culture, it's something that's attached to pop culture theories.
You're not wrong on that one. It's very much important for like how, in terms of stuff we see, like inspired definitely a lot of creators. Like you can see a lot of people say, I was inspired by H.P. Lovecraft. Like Alan Moore is definitely majorly inspired by him as one example. But yeah, no, it's always been an accessory rather than a major work onto itself that everyone knows. Honestly, like H.P. Lovecraft died in obscurity. It's not. It's so. I always kind of find it insane that people are like, we have to bash him when it's like, guy didn't even make fucking money off of his shit. So like I said, I always find it more funny than like what's the worst thing you can do to the guy that real life hasn't done to him?
It's like you're trying to cancel a guy that's already been canceled. You didn't even start. You're canceling something that's non-existent. I think maybe that's the real cosmic horror right there. Those must be the real Lovecraftian protagonists, because they're fighting something that the rest of the world sees as imaginary.
Well, it's like this. It's like this. They want to comment on H.P. Lovecraft because they feel like, oh, we don't look at his problems. And it's like, look, we do know his problems, but also, what have we do to him that real life hasn't done? He died of alcoholism alone in his house without a family around.
Yeah.
Like in obscurity. That is sadder than anything I could do to that man. Like, I can't do any.
And most of his work is pretty much public domain now, so.
Yeah, it's not like even his family could make money off it or what relatives there are. I'm not even sure if there are relatives.
Yeah.
So to me, it's always funny to try and frame Lovecraft in that way, when if you actually go by life, it's like it's kind of freaking ridiculous. We can't really do much at this point, and honestly, we can only look at. And it's not like writers from the past are safe from this. Every writer has problematic elements because that was the time people didn't know better. So trying to necessarily cancel anybody for old material, I always find ridiculous, especially in the case of H.P. Lovecraft. It's like, yes, let us cancel the guy who was canceled by life.
Yeah. In fact, I was just thinking, one of the most ironically Lovecraftian movies I've seen was the Lego movie. When you think about it.
I have to hear this. Mike, give me this explanation. Scarfy, I need to hear every word of how the Lego movie is like Cthulhu.
Well,
or Lovecraft.
The whole idea of the cosmic horror genre is that you're dealing with beings that are essentially beyond our reality. They're on a higher plane of existence, maybe even controlling our every being, or even just passively just noticing or even not caring or interacting with it passively without even noticing. And throughout the entire Lego movie, you see these characters in their Lego universe, and they keep imagining or theorizing, almost to a point of having a religion around it, that there are beings higher than them. And even the main character has this sort of vision of what he can closely describe as a human hand, but he can only describe it with Legos, so you see a human hand in Lego form, which almost ties into the fact that you can't really see the great old ones in their perfect form and glory because our eyes are not adjusted to actually see those things. You can't. It's like trying to see like a fourth dimensional being with two-dimensional eyes. It doesn't work that way. And they even have like strange, like the Craggle thing. It's like they even have like strange alien artifacts from this higher plane of existence, this alternate dimension, and then ultimately, as the main protagonist and near the end of the movie, he falls into this void and ends up in this higher plane of existence. He ends up in the human world, has a Lego figurine, and sees these things.
Ouch. That is fair. That I did not expect, but that's a good explanation, Mike. I think it would be like a 12/12 post on Tumblr. You did a good job. Congratulations. You just reminded me of another one.
But yeah, it's part of the reason why a lot of people keep thinking of Bloodborne as a very Lovecraftian video game. But yeah, we'll get into video games in a second. But yeah, it's more. But Bloodborne, it's really more Solomon Kane than Call of Cthulhu. Although
I would say
Solomon Kane could easily cross over with Call of Cthulhu. He's crossed over with Conan, so.
I understand where you're coming from with that comment, but at the same time, what people often bring up about Bloodborne with the Cthulhu mythos is the true ending of Bloodborne.
Yeah, and that's why people keep thinking of it as a very...
I would say
very Lovecraftian, and I do agree. Well, it does have a very Lovecraftian style story.
Well, here's the thing. I'll say this. Let's just call it like Lovecraftian, kind of like I think one thing about Bloodborne is that it's not just Lovecraft. It's working on a lot of different elements. For one thing, it's also trying to use the soul. It's trying to use the soul system from the Demon Souls games and all that jazz.
Yeah,
you know.
If anything, it would make for a far better Solomon Kane style game.
Well, to be fair, considering how the character usually looks with his clothing, he does kind of have that Solomon Kane look going on, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does.
The iconic cover dude, as I call him. Oh, iconic cover dude! You inspire me so.
Yeah, but to take it back to movies and the like, I have seen a few attempts at making or adapting Lovecraftian stories into movies. In fact, I think there's 2 that was based off of The Strange Case of Charles Dexter Ward, where I forgot what the other one was called. I think one was called like Joseph Kerwin or something, but I've only seen one of them, and one is more of a movie short where it was starring Vincent Price, and it wasn't a good adaptation either.
I actually saw one that's actually kind of interesting that I like a lot, but it is a weird one, and it's experimental. There's a Call of Cthulhu silent movie made in 2005.
I've heard of that one, yeah.
It's a really good one, and I would actually recommend checking it out. It's not the best thing ever, but it is a fun movie. It's a great little attempt at making something. It's an independent production, so I recommend it a lot. But we're kind of forgetting a big movie that we probably should talk about. A big movie. You could say I have to reanimate this discussion.
That was...
Look, let's talk about it, because it's honestly the biggest one.
It's the one everyone knows, though.
It's the one everyone knows, but we would be doing a disservice not to talk about it. We have to kind of do it.
Herbert West Reanimator was adapted into a film during that whole era of, what is it, the 80s slasher flicks?
I would say it's the 80s schlocky horror flicks, because there's a lot of different I would not call it a slasher.
Alright, a schlocky horror. It's basically, or pretty much 80s zombie flick.
I would say that it's probably the best not Bruce Campbell Evil Dead movie.
Yeah, it is.
Jokes aside, there's a lot of sick humor in it that I actually do enjoy.
But yeah, those were during the times where horror movies didn't really, well, at least those kinds of horror movies didn't really try to take themselves too seriously. They had some fun with this one.
I think it was a very good movie, honestly, for what its time. It's enjoyable. I think it's actually a very watchable movie, and plus Jeffrey Combs as Herbert West is honestly kind of iconic as evil mad scientist. He's great. He steals the show. It's like you can see why they made sequels to this damn film. They're not all good, but they made sequels. But Reanimator, yeah, is the most major H.P. Lovecraft adaptation. And we kind of have to note that since it's very atypical of his stuff.
Yeah.
You
I mean,
know?
of all the Lovecraftian stories you could probably adapt into a movie, I mean, Herbert West Reanimator is probably one of the easier ones because they don't go too deep into the cosmic horror stuff. In fact, they don't even
Well,
go into the cosmic horror stuff. It's really just a mad scientist animating dead bodies.
Well, again, it was a simple story that was made for a serial, and honestly, that was probably one of the reasons why it was just easy to adapt. You can just it had easier imagery to do, but it's also just kind of one of those things that just like the storyline's simple. You can do a lot in a movie. You can also take out the worst part about the original story was that it was serialized, and one of the big problems with it is that H.P. Lovecraft was demanded that he would end each chapter on a cliffhanger because it's a serialized story, so you want to keep readers biting at it, essentially. So it takes that aspect out of the movie, making a much more clean film overall. You
Yeah.
know? So
Yeah,
look, I
he has
know
to
it's
do.
like
This is like every story. He had to reanimate someone.
but I'll say this. I think this is important. So this is my theory on Reanimator and its importance in the H.P. Lovecraft. Dr. Herbert West is now the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern of H.P. Lovecraft.
All right, that would be fair.
And okay, for anybody who doesn't know, because look, I'm talking high level Shakespeare bullshit here. Maybe it's not high level Shakespeare bullshit, but at least people should know about this shit. So, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are actually minor characters in the play Hamlet. They are used by Hamlet to manipulate further events in the book to get his uncle caught for his crime and are sentenced to death. Very minor characters who were Hamlet's friends. And in fact, they were so minor in some early adaptations, they are actually cut out of the play entirely. But there was a new play released around the 70s by a guy called Tom Stoppard. I think it was either 70s or 80s. I'm not looking that up right now, but called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. And it's a meta play about being a minor character in a story, about what you're doing kind of off stage. Very important for literature and metafiction in general. And because of Reanimator, I should say because of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Dr. Herbert West, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are now in every adaptation of Hamlet, because despite being so minor, they're now expected to be part of it because of their effect on pop culture and plays as minor characters. So because of Reanimator, now anything that's kind of like a big crossover of like H.P. Lovecraft stories will often have Dr. Herbert West involved in the story, or at least made reference to. In fact, Dr. North is in Providence. You see, the whole thing in Providence is that like the names are changed to not like to say that, oh, H.P. Lovecraft was making fictional versions of them. Northwest, ha ha, Alan, you clever dog. You clever, clever dog. Jokes aside, it's a great run of comics. It's, but I should say, but see that now I've lost my place here a bit. Reanimator. Okay. Because of Reanimator, Dr. Herbert West is now a huge part of the mythos, whether we like to admit it or not.
he's now kind of expected in crossover adaptations and the like. And he'll often get a nod here and there in various other places, when he used to be considered such a minor piece of it, in comparison to stuff like Nyarlathotep or Cthulhu. Honestly, Nyarlathotep is now more obscure than Cthulhu. Oh, wait a minute. I almost forgot about this. You want to know who plays a big part in video games in Cthulhu stuff?
Who?
Nyarlathotep is the main enemy in Persona 2. I'm not joking.
How is it that Persona gets Nyarlathotep, but no Call of Cthulhu official video game gets him?
That's a good point. I don't know why. Nyarlathotep is actually in Persona 2 as the main villain. So to explain this, Nyarlathotep is basically using humanity's evil against it, and at one point, he takes the form of Hitler to fight the protagonist. So, you have Hitler possessed by Nyarlathotep fighting a bunch of Japanese teenagers as the representation of all evil. It is fucking great. I love it.
That is a very meme-worthy series. But
Look,
yeah,
man.
it makes sense. Nyarlathotep does like to take on the form of a pharaoh, too.
Well, the thing about Persona is that it's often a commentary on pop culture. For one thing, one of the main things that connect the friends is their love of Power Rangers. So you can look at it as Japanese teenagers guided by their love of Power Rangers fighting Hitler, possessed by Nyarlathotep, aka the most possible video gaming thing ever, and I love it. Okay, I'm kind of joking and I'm simplifying a lot of things here, but the whole point of Persona 2 is often about friendship and hatred in an overwhelming society and how society messes you up. And Nyarlathotep being the evil that we all must live with. Like, the thing they have to do to defeat Nyarlathotep is erase their memories of each other. So he causes this great big sacrifice. He's portrayed as one of the ultimate evils in the Persona series. And keep in mind, the Persona series has very many personal dark enemies in it. For one thing, we can't forget about God himself. Yahweh is actually a pretty major character in the series. Well, if you take the entire Shin Megami Tensei line. But because of that,
Japan.
look, man, I accept it. It is for what it is. It's awesome. Anyway, Nyarlathotep is actually one of the ones who deals the most personal damage to protagonists in that game universe. So honestly, it's like, yeah, fuck. It's sad. It's tragic. It's amazing. I love the story a lot. It's a very good time is had by all. And who is joining us? Oh.
Wait,
Hey, hey, we're
Oh,
actually
Castle.
doing a stream right now, so if you can, we're probably close to almost finishing it at 12 minutes here, dude. Sorry. We're doing this on a Discord, so we're kind of just like we're having some fun.
We'll talk
Time.
later.
Oh, okay.
Just tune into the stream. We'll talk to you through there.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll stop. Yeah, I'll get off.
Thanks, man.
Bye.
We appreciate you.
But yeah, well, yeah. Let's go over to games now. It's like
We are
Although-
professional setup.
actually, before we switch entirely to games, I will note that a lot of the actual visual mediums that have done a very valiant attempt at adapting Lovecraftian stories were done by indie studios and YouTubers. I mean, there's a YouTube video where someone adapted in black and white, almost like a silent film, but with a monologue over it, Shadow Out of Time. It is by far one of the best adaptations of a Lovecraftian story I've seen on YouTube. So that's something that'd be worth looking up. Also, if you guys want to laugh or cringe a little, you can always look up Cthulhu Rock Opera of Doom on YouTube, assuming it's still around.
That is the most cringe Call of Cthulhu thing I've ever saw in my life.
Oh yeah, Doom is spelled with 3 O's in that one. If you're looking for
so amazingly awkward. I don't know how it exists.
Oh my god. You know what? One of these days I'll do a full review of it.
I might do a thread on it. It is an amazingly awkward film. And I'm actually thinking of doing a thread on the sequel to Warriors of Virtue 2.
Yeah, it was like, but yeah, Rock Opera of Doom is like the one thing I've seen where it's like I almost feel like I could do better green screening than these guys. And
Mike, I've seen you do better green screening.
they even have like CGI 3D CGI models that are glitchy.
You don't even have a budget, and you do better 3D screening.
I know.
Your budget is what you make from your job.
Yeah, that's essentially it. And
Like,
the animation glitches out on some of the 3D models I've seen. It was like, so he's riding on a 3D camel that's not even moving. It's just like sliding across the desert because they couldn't animate the legs.
I would take a class. Like, man, we have one friend who's able to do some pretty great animation too. My friend Hal, who is just like, seriously, he does a bunch of art on occasion. He's done some art for me before. Great dude. He does amazing animation, and he basically works zero. But like, it's kind of insane that I know better animators than that movie.
Yeah. It's cringe, but I still laugh whenever I see it. It's like,
To be fair, I'm not sure if it's as cringe as my favorite cringe fest recently was Van Von Hunter, the movie by Tokyo Pop.
oh my god, that.
There's levels of cringe, man. There's levels of cringe, and my god. Hey, Shim, welcome
Alrighty.
to the stream. Like,
We were just talking about Cthulhu Rock Opera of Doom.
Yeah, no, I'm just kind of insane that it kind of drives me up the wall that, you know, there is a Cthulhu rock opera of Doom, and it's terrible. Anyway,
But yeah,
it's special, so special.
yeah, with moving on to things like video games. I mean, well, as far as video games goes, I've seen like, well, let's face it, there's probably no real good Call of Cthulhu video game that I've ever seen. Well, I've seen some good games that have Call of Cthulhu elements in them, but no real good Call of Cthulhu games. But I've seen valiant attempts. I mean,
Well, there's the major one, of course, which is Eternal Darkness is the major one I think of often.
yeah, except it's not officially Call of Cthulhu. It's a very good game. It does take a lot out of Call of Cthulhu with the occult stuff involved, and a lot of the creature designs are very Lovecraftian inspired. I think one of them might as well be. I'm trying to remember the names of. Yeah, even the names sound very much Lovecraftian, like Xenototh or Chaturga.
Well, I'm just saying with
Or that big thing that was in that temple. They might as well have named that thing like Abolth or something.
Well, I'm just saying
Mantarok, I think.
You were talking about games inspired by Cthulhu, but not being part of Cthulhu.
But yeah,
In terms of,
and there's a lot
What
of
if-
good ones that were inspired by Cthulhu. I mean, I've seen. In fact, whenever I look at the cinematics for Diablo 2, I always think of it as Lovecraftian because the guy who's doing a lot of the dialogue in those cinematics, the old guy that was in the insane asylum, He is a typical Lovecraftian narrator. I mean, with
Fair enough.
the way he describes things. By the way, Lovecraft really loves his unreliable narrators.
Well, yeah, it's H.P. Lovecraft. I mean,
They're unreliable because they've been traumatized by what they've seen.
yeah, no, there's agreement on that one.
Oh, what about a Bethesda game?
I think he's talking about is Isomouth. Yeah,
Innsmouth?
you know, Innsmouth. Yeah, I don't know why I had issue pronouncing that, but I did, and I'm sorry. Okay, Joe. Like,
Okay, which game was based in the town of Innsmouth?
all right, let's.
I think he's talking about Dark Corners of the Earth. Which,
Dark Corners of the Earth.
which I liked throughout the first half, but you could easily tell that around the second half, that was when they had the change in management, because it suddenly devolved into a first-person shooter.
That is true. That is true.
But that game was good when you weren't shooting things. It was even better when you were just running away from stuff. Because it understood chase scenes fairly well as in that game. I mean, it recreated one of the most iconic scenes in Shadow over Innsmouth, where it became not just about outrunning your pursuers, but putting as much stuff as you can between you and your pursuers. Locked doors, barricades, everything. I mean, in the tabletop RPG, that's pretty much what you do. You don't just run, you try to get barriers between you and that thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like honestly,
Part of the downfall of Dark Corners of the Earth was that it tried to do way too many things at once.
So I have a question to ask you, and this is just a question: can the angry video game nerd be considered a Cthulhu mythos story? Think about it. He forces himself to play games that drive him up the wall, slowly maddening him as it goes on, where he imagines fighting Bugs Bunny. Is James Rolfe making a commentary on the... I'm joking, I'm shitting.
No, he's a Stephen King novel at this point.
So he's a Stephen King novel.
Yeah,
you know something? We should probably mention Stephen King works at this point, because there is some play in that. It would probably not exist without the Cthulhu mythos as a whole. Like, that's just one major example there, you know? And I can't believe we kind of are forgetting about that. So,
yeah, I haven't read too much Stephen King. I mean,
well,
there was The Mist. That was about it.
Well, I'm thinking about it, specifically the clown monster.
Oh yeah, that thing.
Like, come on, that's a pretty blatant Cthulhu story right there.
It is. But I think the approach Stephen King likes to do is that he makes you get to know the creature before you see it as the creature.
Well, I guess that's one aspect. With Stephen King, I often think of him in terms of what I like to call symbol writing. He kind of draws in like elements of symbolism and logic that are kind of weird. Like, basically, it's like, this works because it represents this type thing, which is a huge thing with it, because it represents fear, it represents decay. There's a lot of elements of that in the story. And, like, that's not even getting into the weird turtle god thing that's in the book, nor the other thing the book is infamous for. The other thing the book is infamous for. I'm just gonna let it be there. I'm not gonna talk about it, because frankly, I don't know who's listening on YouTube, and I rather be careful of that shit sometimes.
All right, we'll leave that as is. But yeah, one of the things you also gotta understand about Lovecraft style of writing is that most of the interesting stuff is not really happening to the narrator. He usually finds that out secondhand. I mean, you see that in the story Colors Out of Space.
Yes. Basically. So that's a whole play into that story aspect with it. But, at this point, we're getting to 60 minutes here, and I am getting a little tired right now because I haven't had anything to eat tonight, so I'm going to actually take care of that soon. So, I think we should...
All right, we'll start wrapping things up.
Well,
I mean,
anyway.
I was gonna go over like good games or mildly good games that seem like Lovecraftian inspired. I mean, The
something?
Last Door being one of them. I mean, it's a pixel art indie game, but that's another good one.
Hey, dude, let's go over them, list them off, and we'll use that to wrap up the segment.
I mean, of the ones I could possibly recommend, I mean, there's The Last Door. And trying to remember what were some of the other ones I played. I might have to go through my Steam library. If you're okay with like really old, I mean, it hasn't aged well, but Alone in the Dark was a good one way back in the day. The Penumbra series is another good, it's like Lovecraftian inspired game. If you played Amnesia: The Dark Descent, play the Penumbra series. Specifically Penumbra 1 and 2. And that's really most of them so far.
This is a weird question, but what about Myst? Because I know there's like deep lore story elements to that one that are very like weird to an extent.
What, the Stephen King's The Mist?
No, like the game series Myst.
Oh, Mist. I wouldn't really say that was Lovecraftian. I mean, it's more fantasy than cosmic horror. It's basically you're dealing with magic books.
That's fair. I know about the whole trapped in a book thing and stuff. I have exposure to it. I played some of the games, but I never played them to completion.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's a major cosmic horror. It's really more like what cosmic wondrous, where you're just stuck in awe and wonder at everything. Which is kind of what the developers were going for. Is like they love making this beautiful 3D artwork. Back in the days when it was surprising to see detailed 3D art in games.
That's fair. That's fair. We are going to leave it here tonight. It was good having you all, and I hope you had fun listening to this little stream for Halloween.
All right. Sleep tight, guys. Don't get devoured.
Yep. And don't draw and say, fuck. Okay, never mind. We're gonna make this a little longer. I forgot to talk about one thing.
What?
We need to talk about this. And so sorry, this is gonna be a special bonus thing. I'm gonna wait out my hunger here. We forgot to talk about the role-playing game.
Oh yeah.
Let's do it, man. Let's do it. I have a story. You have a story. So, Call of Cthulhu actually probably got popular for one reason: the role-playing game. It's such a huge part of geek culture at this point that honestly, I think it's probably the most way people are exposed to H.P. Lovecraft at all.
Oh, that was how I got exposed.
So, let's go over some stories. Let me talk to you about I'm going to call him Mr. Gray, Kung Fu Investigator. So I made a character as a shitpost for one game called the Kung Fu Investigator. He was this ugly man who was the best fighter. And he was like, ugh, a devious monster, you don't say. And he got a lot of crits on a monster that he couldn't fight against. And he won at one point, but he died. That was the Kung Fu Investigator. And that's kind of like Call of Cthulhu in a nutshell. you play the game to wait out a clock of dying and trying to figure out how best not to die. Good DMs are very easy, know how to build up the atmosphere. Bad ones are just like, you're dead. Oh, you're dead insane. You're insane and dead. But Mike, you have probably the best story with Call of Cthulhu, so I'll let you.
Oh yeah, I mean, I did play as a stereotypical PI style investigator, and we had, I forgot who else was in the party, but I definitely know one other guy was in the party because he was an explosives expert. And I also know the player. And the player was, we all knew him as friends as the one guy where in every game he ever plays in, he would find the dumbest way to get himself killed. So we didn't have much hope for him to surviving a Call of Cthulhu game already. But yeah, this was the same kind of guy who... this was the same guy... I'll call him Short Timer. There was the same kind of Short Timer who decided, oh, I'm just gonna kick this animated suit of armor in the ass because it doesn't have eyes, so it can't see who did it. Yeah, it didn't work out for him. And I think he was also the guy who played in a horror game where he ran into a burning building to retrieve his lighter for some reason. I'm like, okay. But here's how my Call of Cthulhu game went working with Short Timer. We eventually came across this portal, which we determined was where all the strange Lovecraftian monsters are coming from. So, Short Timer, who's our explosive expert, figures out a plan to get rid of them all at once. He decides to put plastic explosives into a barrel full of Jack Daniels, set it on fire, and put all his explosives into that barrel full of Jack Daniels. Set it on fire and then roll it through the portal so that it would explode and kill off all the monsters at once. The monsters caught the barrel and rolled it right back. I made my dex check and dodged it. The guy behind me made the dex check and dodged it. Short Timer didn't make his dex check and got hit by the thing. And then he had to remind the DM that, oh, this wouldn't be so bad if it weren't for the fact that I was holding all of our extra ammunition, all of our extra guns, and all of our extra explosives. At that point, the keeper in our game, he said, thanks for reminding me. Everyone roll a constitution check. We all died. We got blown the fuck up because of this guy. And I just had to say, it's like, Short Timer, you outdid yourself this time. Not only did you get yourself killed in one of the stupidest ways I've ever seen, but you managed to get the rest of us killed along with you. So
everyone died.
That was how our Call of Cthulhu game ended. You see, yeah, Call of Cthulhu is just one of those games where if you play it poorly, you're gonna see more more player characters dying off than when they're playing Paranoia. But that's a tabletop game for another time.
It's true. With that, we'll leave you guys off of our stupid Call of Cthulhu adventures. You guys have a nice night and have a safe Halloween.
Keep your sanity in check, guys. Good night. Alright. That ends that one.
I fixed